Lord and lady, that's a lovely tumble, old Cobb said respectfully, his eyes watering slightly. You're a gentleman, Coat, and I'm glad to know you. The smith's prentice set his glass down only to have it tip onto its side and roll across the bar. He snatched it up before it skittered over the edge and turned it over, eyeing its rounded bottom suspiciously. Jake laughed a loud farmer's laugh at his bewilderment, while Carter made a point of setting his glass on the bar topside down. I don't know how they do it in Ranish, Carter said to the boy, but round here, there's a reason we call it a tumble. The smith's prentice looked properly abashed and turned his tumble upside down to match the others on the bar. The innkeeper gave him a reassuring smile before gathering up the glasses and disappearing into the kitchen. Right then, old Cobb said briskly, rubbing his hands together. We'll have a whole evening of this after the two of you get back from Baden. But the weather won't wait on me, and I don't doubt the Orsons are eager to be on the road. After they filtered out of the Waystone in a loose group, Kvothe emerged from the kitchen and returned to the table where Bast and Chronicler sat. I like Shep, Bast said quietly. Cobb might be a bit of a crusty old cuss, but he knows what he's talking about most of the time. Cobb doesn't know half of what he thinks he does, Kvothe said. You saved everyone last night. If not for you, it would have gone through the room like a farmer threshing wheat. That just isn't true, Reshi, Bast said, his tone plainly offended. You would have stopped it. That's what you do. The innkeeper shrugged the comment away, unwilling to argue. Bast's mouth formed into a hard, angry line, his eyes narrowing. Still, Chronicler said softly, breaking the tension before it grew too thick. Cobb was right. It was a brave thing to do. You have to respect that. No, I don't, Kvothe said. Cobb was right about that. These aren't good times to be brave. He motioned for Chronicler to pick up his pen. Still, I wish I'd been braver, and Shep was home kissing his young wife, too. Chapter 18. Wine and Blood. Eventually, Will and Sim pulled me from the warm embrace of the archives. I struggled and cursed them, but they were firm in their convictions, and the three of us braved the chill wind on the road to Imre. We made our way to the Aeolian, claiming a table near the eastern hearth where we could watch the stage and keep our backs warm. After a drink or two, I felt the book longing fade to a dull ache. The three of us talked and played cards, and eventually I began to enjoy myself, despite the fact that Denna was doubtless out there somewhere, hanging on Ambrose's arm. After several hours, I sat slouched in my chair, drowsy and warm from the nearby fire, while Will and Sim bickered about whether the High King of Modeg was a true ruling monarch or merely a figurehead. I was nearly asleep when a heavy bottle knocked down hard onto our table, followed by the delicate chime of wine glasses. Denna stood next to our table. "Play along," she said under her breath. "You've been waiting for me. I'm late, and you're upset." Blearily, I struggled upright in my seat and tried to blink myself awake. Sim leaped to the challenge. "It's been an hour," he said, scowling fiercely. He tapped the table firmly with 2 fingers. "Don't think buying me a drink is going to fix matters. I want an apology." "It's not entirely my fault," Denna said, radiating embarrassment. She turned and gestured to the bar. I looked, worried I would see Ambrose standing there, watching me smugly in his goddamn hat. But it was only a balding Sealdish man. He made a short, odd bow toward us, halfway between acknowledgement and apology. Sim scowled at him, then turned back to Denna and made a grudging gesture to the empty chair across from me. "Fine. So are we going to play corners or what?" Denna sank down into the chair, sitting with her back to the room, then leaned over to kiss Simon on the forehead. "Perfect," she said. "I was scowling too," Willem said. Denna slid him the bottle. "And for that, you may pour." She set the glasses in front of each of us. A gift from my overly persistent suitor. She gave an irritated sigh. They always need to give you something. She eyed me speculatively. You're curiously mute. I rubbed a hand over my face. I didn't expect to see you tonight, I said. You caught me nearly napping. Willem poured a pale pink wine, then passed around the glasses while Denna examined the etching on the top of the bottle. Cerbor, she mused. I don't even know if this is a decent vintage. It's not, actually, Simmons said matter-of-factly as he took his glass. Cerbor is a Turin. Only wines from Vintus have a vintage, technically. He took a sip. Really? I asked, looking at my own glass. Sim nodded. It's a common misuse of the word. Denna took a drink and nodded to herself. Good wine, though, she said. Is he still at the bar? He is, I said without looking. Well then, she smiled. It seems you're stuck with me. Have you ever played corners? Sim asked hopefully. I'm afraid not, Denna said, but I'm a quick study. Sim explained the rules with help from Will and myself. Denna asked a few pointed questions, showing she understood the gist of it. I was glad. Since she was sitting across the table from me, she was going to be my partner. What do you usually play for? She asked. Depends, Will said. Sometimes we play by the hand, sometimes by the set. For a set of hands, then, Denna said. How much? We can do a practice set first, Sim said, brushing his hair out of his eyes. Since you're just learning and all. Her eyes narrowed. I don't need any special treatment. She reached into a pocket and brought a coin up onto the table. A jot too much for you boys? It was too much for me, especially with a partner who had just learned the game. Be careful with these two, I said. They play for blood. In point of fact, Willem said, I have no use for blood, and play for money instead. He fingered through his purse until he found a jot, which he pressed firmly onto the table. I am willing to play a practice game, but if she finds the thought insulting, I will thrash her and take whatever she is willing to lay on the table. Denna grinned at that. You're my kind of guy, Will. The first hand went fairly well. Denna mislaid a trick, but we couldn't have won anyway, as the cards were against us. But the second hand, she made a mistake in the bidding. Then, when Sim corrected her, she got flustered and bid wildly. Then she accidentally let out of turn. Not a huge mistake, but she led the Jack of Hearts, which let everyone know exactly what sort of hand she had. She realized it too, and I heard her mutter something distinctly unladylike under her breath. True to their word, Will and Sim moved in ruthlessly to take advantage of the situation. Given the weak cards in my hand, there wasn't much I could do but sit and watch as they won the next two tricks and began to close on her like hungry wolves. Except they couldn't. She pulled a clever card force, then produced the King of Hearts, which didn't make any sense as she'd tried to lead the Jack before. Then she produced the Ace, too. I realized her fumbling misplay had been an act slightly before Will and Sim. I managed to keep it off my face until I saw the dim realization creep onto their expressions. Then I started to laugh. Don't be smug, she said to me. I had you fooled, too. You look like you were going to be sick when I showed the Jack. She put her hand in front of her mouth and made her eyes wide and innocent. Oh my! I've never played corners before. Could you teach me? Is it true that sometimes people play for money? Denna snapped down another card onto the table and gathered in the trick. Please. You lot should be glad I'm giving you a slap on the hand instead of the profound full-night fleecing you deserve. She mopped up the rest of the hand relentlessly, and it gave us such a solid lead that the rest of the set was a foregone conclusion. Denna never missed a trick after that, and played with enough cunning flair to make Manette seem like a dray horse by comparison. That was instructional, Will said as he slid his jot toward Denna. I might need to lick my wounds a bit. Denna lifted her glass in a salute. To the gullibility of the well-educated. We touched our glasses to hers and drank. You lot have been curiously absent, Denna said. I've been keeping an eye out for you almost 2 span. Why's that? Sim asked. Denna gave Will and Sim a calculating look. You two are students at the university too, aren't you? The special one that teaches magic? That's us, Sim said agreeably. We are chock full of arcane secrets. We tinker with dark forces better left alone, Will said nonchalantly. It's called the Arcanum, by the way, I pointed out. Denna nodded seriously as she leaned forward, her expression intent. Between the 3 of you, I'm guessing you know how most of it works. She looked at us. So tell me, how does it work? It? I asked. Magic, she said. Real magic. Will, Sim, and I exchanged glances. It's complicated, I said. Denna shrugged and leaned back in her chair. I have all the time in the world, she said, and I need to know how it works. Show me. Do some magic. The 3 of us shifted uncomfortably in our seats. Denna laughed. We're not supposed to, I said. What? She asked. Does it disturb some cosmic balance? It disturbs the constables, I said. They don't take kindly to that sort of thing over here. The masters at the university don't care for it much either, Will said. They're very mindful of the university's reputation. Oh, come now, Denna said. I heard a story about how our man Kvothe called up some sort of demon wind. She jerked her thumb at the door behind her, right in the courtyard outside. Had Ambrose told her that? It was just a wind, I said. No demon involved. They whipped him for it too, Will said. Denna looked at him as if she couldn't tell if he were joking, then shrugged. Well, I wouldn't want to get anyone in trouble, she said with glaring insincerity, but I am powerfully curious, and I have secrets I'm willing to offer in trade. Sim perked up at this. What sort of secrets? All the vast and varied secrets of womankind, she said with a smile. I happen to know several things that can help improve your failing relations with the gentler sex. Sim leaned closer to Will and asked in a stage whisper, Did she say failing or flailing? Will pointed at his own chest, then Sim's. Me, failing. You, flailing. Denna raised one eyebrow and cocked her head to one side, looking at the 3 of us expectantly. I cleared my throat uncomfortably. We're discouraged from sharing Arcanum's secrets. It's not strictly against the laws of the university. It is, actually, Simon interrupted, giving me an apologetic look. Several laws. Denna gave a dramatic sigh, looking up at the high ceiling. I thought as much, she said. You lot just talk a good game. Admit it, you can't turn cream into butter. I happen to know for a fact that Sim can turn cream into butter, I said. He just doesn't like to because he's lazy. I'm not asking you to teach me magic, Denna said. I just need to know how it works. Sim looked at Will. That wouldn't fall under unsanctioned divulgence, would it? Illicit revelation, Will said grimly. Denna leaned forward conspiratorially, resting her elbows on the table. In that case, she said, I am also willing to finance a night of extravagant drinking, far above and beyond the simple bottle you see before you. She turned her gaze to Will. One of the bartenders here has recently discovered a dusty stone bottle in the basement. Not only is it fine old Scutton, drink of the kings of Sealdom, it is a Miravani as well. Willem's expression didn't change, but his dark eyes glittered. I looked around the largely empty room. Orden is a slow night. We shouldn't have any trouble if we keep things quiet. I looked at the other 2. Sim was grinning his boyish grin. It seems reasonable. A secret for a secret. If it is truly a Mirovani, Willem said, I am willing to risk offending the master's sensibilities somewhat. Right then, Denna said with a wide grin. You first. Sim leaned forward in his chair. Sympathy is probably the easiest to get a grip on, he said, then paused, as if uncertain how to proceed. I stepped in. You know how a block and tackle lets you lift something too heavy for you to lift by hand? Denna nodded. Sympathy lets us do things like that, I said, but without all the awkward rope and pulleys. Willem dropped a pair of iron drabs onto the table and muttered a binding. He pushed the right-hand one with a finger, and the left-hand one slid across the table at the same time, mimicking the motion. Denna's eyes went a little wide at this, and while she didn't gasp, she did draw a long breath through her nose. It only then occurred to me that she'd probably never seen anything like this before. Given my studies, it was easy to forget that someone could live mere miles from the university without ever having any exposure to even the most basic sympathy. To her credit, Denna recovered from her surprise without missing a beat. With only the slightest hesitation, she reached out a finger to touch one of the drabs. This is how the bell in my room worked, she mused. I nodded. Will slid his drab across the table, and Denna picked it up. The other drab rose off the table too, bobbing in mid-air. It's heavy, she said, then nodded to herself. Right, because it's like a pulley. I'm lifting both of them. Heat, light, and motion are all just energy, I said. We can't create energy or make it disappear, but sympathy lets us move it around or change it from one type into another. She put the drab back down on the table, and the other followed suit. And this is useful how? Will grunted with vague amusement. Is a water wheel useful? He asked. Is a windmill? I reached into the pocket of my cloak. Have you ever seen a sympathy lamp? I asked. She nodded. I slid my hand lamp across the table to her. They work under the same principle. They take a little bit of heat and turn it into light. It converts one type of energy into another. Like a money changer, Will said. Denna turned the lamp over in her hands curiously. Where does it get the heat? The metal itself holds heat, I explained. If you leave it on, you'll eventually feel the metal get chilly. If it gets too cold, it won't work. I pointed. I made that one, so it's pretty efficient. Just the heat from your hand should be enough to keep it working. Denna flicked the switch, and dull red light shone out in a narrow arc. I can see how heat and light are related, she said thoughtfully. The sun is bright and warm. Same with a candle. She frowned. But motion doesn't fit into it. A fire can't push something. Think about friction, Sim chimed in. When you rub something, it gets hot. He demonstrated by running his hand back and forth vigorously across the fabric of his pants. Like this. He continued rubbing his thigh enthusiastically, unaware of the fact that since it was happening below the level of the table, it looked more than slightly obscene. It's all just energy. If you keep doing it, you'll feel it get hot. Denna somehow kept a straight face, but Willem started to laugh, covering his face with one hand as if embarrassed to be sitting at the same table with Sim. Simon froze and flushed red with embarrassment. I came to his rescue. It's a good example. The hub of a wagon wheel will be warm to the touch. That heat comes from the motion of the wheel. A sympathist can make the energy go the other way, from heat into motion. I pointed to the lamp. Or from heat into light. Fine, she said. You're energy money changers. But how do you make it happen? There's a special way of thinking called alar, Willem said. You believe something so strongly that it becomes so. He lifted up one drab and the other followed it. I believe these two drabs are connected. So they are. Suddenly, the other drab clattered to the tabletop. If I stop believing, it stops being so. Denna picked up the drab. So, it's like faith? she said skeptically. More like strength of will, Sim said. She cocked her head. Why don't you call it strength of will, then? Alar sounds better, Willem said. I nodded. If we didn't have impressive-sounding names for things, no one would take us seriously. Denna nodded appreciatively, a smile tugging at the corners of her lovely mouth. And that's it, then? Energy and strength of will? And the sympathetic link, I said. Will's water wheel analogy is a good one. The link is like a pipe leading to the water wheel. A bad link is like a pipe full of holes. What makes a good link? Denna asked. The more similar two objects are, the better the link. Like this. I poured an inch of the pale wine into my cup and dipped my finger into it. Here is a perfect link to the wine, I said. A drop of the wine itself. I stood and walked to the nearby hearth. I murmured a binding and let a drop fall from my finger onto the hot metal and iron holding the burning logs. I sat back down just as the wine in my glass started to steam, then boil. And that, Willem said grimly, is why you never want a sympathist to get a drop of your blood. Denna looked at Willem, then back to the glass, her face going pale. Black hands, Will, Simmons said with a horrified look. What a thing to say! He looked at Denna. No sympathist would ever do something like that, he said earnestly. It's called malfeasance, and we don't do it. Ever. Denna managed a smile, though it was a bit strained. If no one ever does it, why is there a name for it? They used to, I said. But not anymore. Not for 100 years. I let the binding go, and the wine stopped boiling. Denna reached out and touched the nearby bottle. Why doesn't this wine boil too? She asked, puzzled. It's the same wine. I tapped my temple. The Alar. My mind provides the focus and direction. If that's a good link, she asked, what's a bad one? Here, let me show you. I pulled out my purse, guessing coins would seem less alarming after Willem's comment. Sim, do you have a hard penny? He did, and I arranged 2 lines of coins on the table in front of Denna. I pointed to a pair of iron drabs and murmured a binding. Lift it up, I said. She picked up one drab and the other followed it. I pointed to the second pair. A drab and my single remaining silver talent. Now that one. Denna picked up the second drab and the talent followed it into the air. She moved both hands up and down like the arms of a scale. This second one's heavier. I nodded. Different metals. They're less similar, so you have to put more energy into it. I pointed to the drab and the silver penny and muttered a third binding. Denna put the first 2 drabs into her left hand and picked up the third in her right. The silver penny followed it into the air. She nodded to herself. And this one's heavier still because it's a different shape and a different metal. Exactly, I said. I pointed to the fourth and final pair, a drab and a piece of chalk. Denna almost couldn't get her fingers underneath the drab to pick it up. It's heavier than all the others together, she said. It's got to be 3 pounds. Iron to chalk is a lousy link, Willem said. Bad transference. But you said energy couldn't be created or destroyed, Denna said. If I have to struggle to lift this tiny piece of chalk, where does the extra energy go? Clever, Willem chuckled. So clever. I went a year before I thought to ask that. He eyed her in admiration. Some energy is lost into the air. He waved one hand. Some goes into the objects themselves. And some goes into the body of the sympathist who is controlling the link. He frowned. That can get dangerful. Dangerous, Sim corrected gently. Denna looked at me. So right now you're believing each of these drabs is connected to each of these other things. I nodded. She moved her hands around. The coins and chalk bobbed in the air. Isn't that hard? It is, Willem said. But our Kvothe is a bit of a show-off. That's why I've been so quiet, Sim said. I didn't know you could hold 4 bindings at once. That's impressive as hell. I can do 5 if I need to, I said, but that's pretty much my limit. Sim smiled at Denna. One more thing. Watch this. He pointed at the floating piece of chalk. Nothing happened. Come on, Sim said plaintively. I'm trying to show her something. Then show her, I said smugly, leaning back in my chair. Sim took a deep breath and stared hard at the piece of chalk. It trembled. Will leaned close to Denna and explained. One sympathist can oppose another's alar, he said. It is just a matter of firmly believing that a drab is not the same as a silver penny at all. Will pointed, and the penny clattered to the tabletop. Foul! I protested, laughing. 2 on 1 isn't fair. It is in this case, Simmons said, and the chalk trembled again. Fine, I said, taking a deep breath. Do your worst. The chalk dropped to the table quickly, followed by the drab, but the silver talent stayed where it was. Sim sat back in his chair. You're creepy, he said, shaking his head. Fine, you win. Willem nodded and relaxed as well. Denna looked at me. So, your alar is stronger than theirs put together? Probably not, I said graciously. If they had practiced working together, they could probably beat me. Her eyes ranged over the scattered coins. So, that's it? She asked, sounding slightly disappointed. It's all just energy money changing? There are other arts, I said. Sim does alchemy, for example. Well, I, Willem said, focus on being pretty. Denna looked us over again, her eyes serious. Is there a type of magic that's just... She wiggled her fingers vaguely. Just sort of writing things down? There's sigildry, I said. Like that bell in your room. It's like permanent sympathy. But it's still money changing, right? She asked. Just energy? I nodded. Denna looked embarrassed as she asked. What if someone told you they knew a type of magic that did more than that? A magic where you sort of wrote things down, and whatever you wrote became true. She looked down nervously, her fingers tracing patterns on the tabletop. Then, if someone saw the writing, even if they couldn't read it, it would be true for them. They'd think a certain thing, or act a certain way, depending on what the writing said. She looked up at us again, her expression a strange mix of curiosity, hope, and uncertainty. The 3 of us looked at each other. Willem shrugged. Sounds a damn sight easier than alchemy, Simmons said. I'd rather do that than spend all day unbinding principles. Sounds like fairy tale magic, I said. Storybook stuff that doesn't really exist. I certainly never heard about anything like that at the university. Denna looked down at the tabletop where her fingers still traced patterns against the wood. Her mouth was pursed slightly, her eyes distant. I couldn't tell if she was disappointed or simply thoughtful. Why do you ask? Denna looked up at me, and her expression quickly slid into a wry smile. She shrugged away the question. It was just something I heard, she said dismissively. I thought it sounded too good to be true. She looked over her shoulder. I seem to have outlasted my overenthusiastic suitor, she said. Will held up the flat of his hand. We had an arrangement, he said. There was drink involved, and a woman's secret. I'll have a word with the barman before I leave, Denna said, her eyes dancing with amusement. As for the secret, there are 2 ladies sitting behind you. They've been making eyes at you for most of the evening. The one in green fancies Sim, while the other one with short blonde hair seems to have a thing for Sealdish men who focus on being pretty. We have already made note of them, Willem said without turning to look. Unfortunately, they are already in the company of a young Modegan gentleman. The gentleman is not with them in any romantic sense, Denna said. While the ladies have been eyeing you, the gentleman has been making it abundantly clear that he prefers redheads. She lay her hand on my arm possessively. Unfortunately for him, I have already staked my claim. I fought the urge to look at the table. Are you serious? I asked. Don't worry, she said to Will and Sim. I'll send Diak over to distract the Modegan. That will leave the door open for the two of you. What's Diak going to do? Simmons said with a laugh. Juggle? Denna gave him a frank look. What? Simmons said. What? Diak isn't sly. Denna blinked at him. He and Stanchion own the Aeolian together, she said. Didn't you know that? They own the place, Sim said. They're not, together. Denna laughed. Of course they are. But Diak is up to his neck in women, Simon protested. He can't. Denna looked at him as if he were simple, then to Will and myself. The two of you knew, didn't you? Willem shrugged. I hadn't any knowledge of it, but small wonder he is a Basha. He is attractive enough. Will hesitated, frowned. Basha. What is the word for that here? A man who is intimate with both women and men. Lucky, Denna suggested. Tired? Ambidextrous? Ambisextrous, I corrected. That won't do, Denna chided me. If we don't have impressive-sounding names for things, no one will take us seriously. Sim blinked at her, obviously unable to come to grips with the situation. You see, Denna said slowly, as if explaining to a child, it's all just energy, and we can direct it in different ways. She blossomed into a brilliant smile, as if realizing the perfect way to explain the situation to him. It's like when you do this. She began to vigorously rub her hands up and down her thighs, mimicking his earlier motion. It's all just energy. By this point, Willem was hiding his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent laughter. Simmons' expression was still incredulous and confused, but now it was also a furious, blushing red. I got to my feet and took Denna's elbow. Leave the poor boy alone, I said as I steered her gently toward the door. He's from Aetur. They're laced a little tightly in those parts. Chapter 19. Gentlemen and Thieves. It was late when Denna and I left the Aeolian, and the streets were empty. In the distance, I heard fiddle music and the hollow clopping of a horse's hooves on cobblestones. So what rock have you been hiding under? She asked. The usual rock, I said. Then a thought occurred to me. Did you come looking for me at the university? At the big square building that smells like coal smoke? Denna shook her head. I wouldn't begin to know where to find you there. It's like a maze. If I can't catch you playing at Anchors, I know I'm out of luck. She looked at me curiously. Why? Someone showed up asking for me, I said with a dismissive gesture. She said I'd sold her a charm. I thought it might be you. I did come looking for you a while back, she said, but I never mentioned your abundant charm. The conversation lulled and silence swelled between us. I couldn't help but think of her walking arm in arm with Ambrose. I didn't want to know any more about it, but at the same time, it was the only thing in my head. I came to visit you at the Grey Man, I said, just to fill the air between us. But you'd already gone. She nodded. Kellen and I had a bit of a falling out. Nothing too bad, I hope. I gestured to her throat. I notice you still have the necklace. Denna touched the teardrop emerald absent-mindedly. No, nothing terrible. You can say this for Kellen. He is a traditionalist. When he gives a gift, he sticks to it. He said the color flattered me, and I should keep the earrings too. She sighed. I'd feel better if he hadn't been so gracious. Still, they're nice to have. A safety net of sorts. They'll make my life easier if I don't hear from my patron soon. You're still hoping to hear from him? I asked. After what happened in Traben? After he's been out of contact for more than a month with no word at all? Denna shrugged. That's just his way. I told you, He's a secretive sort. It's not odd for him to be gone for long stretches of time. I have a friend who is trying to find me a patron, I said. I could have him look for you, too. She looked up at me, her eyes unreadable. It's sweet that you think I deserve better, but I really don't. I have a good voice, but that's it. Who would hire a half-trained musician without even an instrument to her name? Anyone with ears to hear you, I said. Anyone with eyes to see. Denna looked down, her hair falling around her face like a curtain. You're sweet, she said quietly, making an odd fidgeting gesture with her hands. What ended up souring things with Kellen? I asked, steering the conversation somewhere safer. I spent too much time entertaining gentlemen callers, she said dryly. You should have explained to him that I'm nothing remotely resembling a gentleman, I said. That might have eased his mind. But I knew I couldn't have been the problem. I'd only managed to visit once. Had it been Ambrose that had come calling? I could picture him in the lavish sitting room all too easily, that damn hat of his hanging casually off the corner of a chair as he drank chocolate and told jokes. Denna's mouth quirked. It was mostly Jeffrey he objected to, she said. Apparently I was supposed to sit quiet and alone in my little box until he came to call on me. How is Jeffrey? I asked, to be polite. Has he managed to get a second thought into his head yet? I expected to get a laugh, but Denna merely sighed. He has, but none of them are particularly good thoughts. She shook her head. He came to Imre to make a name for himself with his poetry, but lost his shirt gambling. I've heard that story before, I said. Happens all the time over at the university. That was just the beginning, she said. He figured he could win his money back, of course. First came the pawn shop, then he borrowed money and lost that too. She made a conciliatory gesture. Though, in all fairness, he didn't gamble that away. Some bitch rooked him. Caught him with the weeping widow of all things. I looked at her, puzzled. The what? Denna looked at me sideways, then shrugged. It's a simple rook, she said. A young woman stands outside a pawn shop all flustered and teary. Then when some rich gent walks by, she explains how she came to the city to sell her wedding ring. She needs money for taxes or to repay a moneylender. She waved her hands impatiently. The details don't matter. What matters is, when she got to town, she asked someone else to pawn the ring for her because she doesn't know a thing about bargaining, of course. Denna stopped walking in front of a pawn shop window, her face a mask of distress. I thought I could trust him, she said, but he just pawned it and ran off with the money. There's the ring right there. She pointed dramatically at the shop's window. But, Denna continued, holding up a finger, luckily, he sold the ring for a fraction of what it's worth. It's a family heirloom worth 40 talents, but the pawn shop is selling it for 4. Denna stepped close and lay her hand on my chest, looking up at me with wide, imploring eyes. If you bought the ring, we could sell it for at least 20. I'd give you your 4 talents back right away. She stepped back and shrugged. That sort of thing. I frowned. How is that a rook? I'll catch on as soon as we go to the assessor. Denna rolled her eyes. That's not how it works. We agree to meet tomorrow at noon, but by the time I get there, you've already bought the ring yourself and run off with it. I suddenly understood. And you split the money with the owner of the pawn shop. She patted my shoulder. I knew you'd catch on sooner or later. It seemed fairly watertight except for one thing. Seems you'd need a special combination of trustworthy yet crooked pawn shop as a partner. True, she admitted. They're usually marked, though. Denna pointed to the top of the nearby pawn shop's doorframe. There were a series of marks that could easily be mistaken for random scratches in the paint. Ah. I hesitated for half a moment before adding, in Tarbean, markings like that meant this was a safe place to fence. I groped for an appropriate euphemism. Questionably acquired goods. If Denna was startled by my confession, she gave no sign of it. She merely shook her head and pointed more closely to the markings, moving her finger as she went. This says, reliable owner, open to simple rooks, even split. She glanced around at the rest of the doorframe and the shop sign. Nothing about fencing goods from Uncle. I never knew how to read them, I admitted. I glanced sideways at her, careful to keep any judgment out of my tone. And you know how this sort of thing works because... I read it in a book, she said sarcastically. How do you think I know about it? She continued walking down the street. I joined her. I don't usually play it as a widow, Denna said, almost as an afterthought. I'm too young for that. For me, it's my mother's ring, or grandmother's. She shrugged. You change it to whatever feels right at the time. What if the gent is honest? I asked. What if he shows up at noon, willing to help? It doesn't happen often, she said with a wry twist to her mouth. Only once for me. Caught me completely by surprise. Now I set things up in advance with the owner just in case. I'm happy to rook some greedy bastard who tries to take advantage of a young girl, but I'm not about to take money off someone who's trying to help. Her expression went hard, unlike the bitch who got hold of Jeffrey. Showed up at noon, did he? Of course he did, she said. Just gave her the money. No need to pay me back, miss. You go save the family farm. Denna ran her hands through her hair, looking up at the sky. A farm? That doesn't even make any sense. Why would a farmer's wife have a diamond necklace? She glanced over at me. Why are the sweet ones such idiots with women? He's noble, I said. Can't he just write home? He's never been on good terms with his family, she said. Less so now. His last letter didn't have any money, just the news that his mother was sick. Something in her voice caught my ear. How sick? I asked. Sick. Denna didn't look up. Very sick. And of course he's already sold his horse and can't afford passage on a ship. She sighed again. It's like watching one of those awful Talon dramas unfold. The Path Ill Chosen or something of the sort. If that's the case, all he has to do is stumble into a church at the end of the 4th act, I said. He'll pray, learn his lesson, and live the rest of his days a clean and virtuous boy. It would be different if he came to me for advice. She made a frustrated gesture. But no. He stops by afterward to tell me what he's done. The guild moneylender cut off his credit. So what does he do? My stomach twisted. He goes to a Gaelet, I said. And he was happy when he told me. Denna looked at me, her expression despairing, like he'd finally figured a way out of this mess. She shivered. Let's go in here. She pointed to a small garden. There's more wind tonight than I thought. I set down my loot case and shrugged out of my cloak. Here, I'm fine. Denna looked like she was going to object for a moment, then drew it around herself. And you say you're not a gentleman, she chided. I'm not, I said. I just know it will smell better after you've worn it. Ah, she said wisely. And then you will sell it to a perfumery and make your fortune. That's been my plan all along, I admitted. A cunning and elaborate scheme. I'm more thief than a gentleman, you see. We sat down on a bench out of the wind. I think you've lost a buckle, she said. I looked down at my loot case. The narrow end was gaping open, and the iron buckle was nowhere to be seen. I sighed and absent-mindedly reached for one of the inner pockets of my cloak. Denna made a tiny noise, nothing loud, just a startled, indrawn breath as she looked suddenly up at me, her eyes wide and dark in the moonlight. I pulled my hand back as if burned by a fire, stammering an apology. Denna began to laugh quietly. "Well, that's embarrassing," she said softly to herself. "I'm sorry," I said quickly. "I wasn't thinking. I've got some wire in there that I can use to hold this closed for now." "Oh," she said. "Of course." Her hands moved inside the cloak for a moment, then she held out a piece of wire. "I'm sorry," I said again. "I was just startled," she said. I didn't think you were the sort to grab hold of a lady without some warning first. I looked down at the lute, embarrassed, and made my hands busy, running the wire through a hole the buckle had left and twisting it tightly shut. It's a lovely lute, Denna said after a long, quiet moment. But that case is in absolute shambles. I tapped myself out buying the lute itself, I said, then looked up as if suddenly struck with an idea. I know. I'll ask Jeffrey to give me the name of his Gaelet. Then I can afford 2 cases. She swatted at me playfully, and I moved to sit next to her on the bench. Things were quiet for a moment. Then Denna looked down at her hands and repeated a fidgeting gesture she'd made several times during our talk. Only now did I realize what she was doing. Your ring? I asked. What happened to it? Denna gave me an odd look. You've had a ring for as long as I've known you, I explained. Silver with a pale blue stone. Her forehead furrowed. I know what it looked like. How did you? You wear it all the time, I said, trying to sound casual, as if I didn't know every detail of her, as if I didn't know her habit of twirling it on her finger while she was anxious or lost in thought. What happened to it? Denna looked down at her hands. A young gentleman has it, she said. Ah, I said. Then, because I couldn't help myself, I added, Who? I doubt you... She paused, then looked up at me. Actually, you might know him. He goes to the university too. Ambrose Jackas. My stomach was suddenly filled with acid and ice. Denna looked away. He has a rough charm about him, she explained. More rough than charm, really, but... She trailed off into a shrug. I see, I said. Then, it must be fairly serious. Denna gave me a quizzical look. Then realization spread onto her face, and she burst out laughing. She shook her head, waving her hands in violent negation. Oh no! God, no! Nothing like that. He came calling a few times. We went to a play. He invited me out for dancing. He's remarkably light on his feet. She drew a deep breath and let it out in a sigh. The first night, he was very genteel. Witty, even. The second night, slightly less so. Her eyes narrowed. On the third night, he got pushy. Things went sour after that. I had to leave my rooms at the Boar's Head because he kept showing up with trinkets and poems. A feeling of vast relief flooded me. For the first time in days, I felt like I was able to take a full lungful of air. I felt a smile threatening to burst out onto my face and fought it down, fearing it would be so wide I'd look like an absolute madman. Denna gave me a wry look. You'd be amazed at how similar arrogance and confidence look at first glance. And he was generous, and rich, which is a nice combination. She held up her naked hand. The fitting was loose on my ring, and he said he'd have it repaired. I take it he wasn't nearly so generous after things went sour. Her red mouth made another wry smile. Not nearly. I might be able to do something, I said, if the ring's important to you. It was important, Denna said, giving me a frank look. But what would you do exactly? Remind him, one gentleman to another, that he should treat women with dignity and respect? She rolled her eyes. Good luck. I simply gave her my most charming smile. I'd already told her the truth of things. I was no gentleman. I was a thief. Chapter 20. The Fickle Wind. The next evening found me at the Golden Pony, arguably the finest inn on the university side of the river. It boasted elaborate kitchens, a fine stable, and a skilled, obsequious staff. It was the sort of upscale establishment only the wealthiest students could afford. I wasn't inside, of course. I was crouched in the deep shadows of the roof, trying not to dwell on the fact that what I was planning went well beyond the bounds of conduct unbecoming. If I was caught breaking into Ambrose's rooms, I would undoubtedly be expelled. It was a clear autumn night with a strong wind. a mixed blessing. The sound of rustling leaves would cover any small noises I might make, but I worried the flapping edges of my cloak might draw attention. Our plan was a simple one. I had slipped a sealed note under Ambrose's door. It was an unsigned, flirtatious request for a meeting in Imre. Will had written it, as Sim and I judged he had the most feminine handwriting. It was a goose chase, but I guessed Ambrose would take the bait. I would have preferred to have someone distract him personally, but the fewer people involved, the better. I could have asked Denna to help, but I wanted it to be a surprise when I returned her ring. Will and Sim were my lookouts. Will in the common room, Sim in the alley by the back door. It was their job to let me know when Ambrose left the building. More importantly, they would alert me if he came back before I'd finished searching his rooms. I felt a sharp tug in my right-hand pocket as the oak twig gave 2 distinct twitches. After a moment, the signal was repeated. Willem was letting me know Ambrose had left the inn. In my left pocket was a piece of birch. Simon held a similar one where he stood watch over the inn's back door. It was a simple, effective signaling system if you knew enough sympathy to make it work. I crawled down the slope of the roof, moving carefully over the heavy clay tiles. I knew from my younger days in Tarbean that they tended to crack and slide and could make you lose your footing. I made it to the lip of the roof, 15 feet off the ground. Hardly a dizzying height, but more than enough to break a leg or a neck. A narrow piece of roof ran beneath the long row of second-story windows. There were 10 in all, and the middle 4 belonged to Ambrose. I flexed my fingers a couple times to loosen them, then began to edge along the narrow strip of roof. The secret is to concentrate on what you're doing. Don't look at the ground. Don't look over your shoulder. Ignore the world and trust it to return the favor. This was the real reason I was wearing my cloak. If I were spotted, I would be nothing more than a dark shape in the night, impossible to identify. Hopefully. The first window was dark, and the second had its curtains drawn, but the third was dimly lit. I hesitated. If you're fair-skinned like me, you never want to peer into a window at night. Your face will stand out against the dark like the full moon. Rather than risk peering in, I dug around in the pockets of my cloak until I found a piece of scrap tin from the fishery that I'd buffed into a makeshift mirror. Then I carefully used it to peer around the corner and through the window. Inside there were a few dim lamps and a canopy bed as big as my entire room back in Anchors. The bed was occupied. Actively occupied. What's more, there seemed to be more naked limbs than 2 people could account for. Unfortunately, my piece of tin was small, and I couldn't view the scene in its full complexity. Otherwise, I might have learned some very interesting things. I briefly considered going back and coming at Ambrose's rooms from the other side, but the wind gusted suddenly, sending leaves skipping across the cobblestones and trying to claw me away from my narrow footing. Heart-pounding, I decided to risk passing this window. I guessed the people inside had better things to do than stargazing. I pulled the hood of my cloak down and held the edges in my teeth, covering my face while leaving my hands free. Thus blinded, I inched my way past the window, listening intently for any signs I'd been spotted. There were a few surprised noises, but they didn't seem to have anything to do with me. The first of Ambrose's windows was elaborate stained glass. Pretty, but not designed to open. The next was perfect. A wide double window. I pulled a thin piece of copper wire from one of the pockets of my cloak and used it to trip the simple latch holding it closed. When the window wouldn't open, I realized that Ambrose had added a drop bar as well. That took several long minutes of tricky work, one-handed in the near-total dark. Thankfully, the wind had died down, at least for the moment. Then, once I'd worked my way past the drop bar, the window still wouldn't budge. I began to curse Ambrose's paranoia as I searched for the third lock, hunting for nearly 10 minutes before I realized the window was simply stuck shut. I tugged on it a couple times, which isn't as easy as it sounds. They don't put handles on the outside, you realize. Eventually, I got overenthusiastic and pulled too hard. The window sprang open, and my weight shifted backward. I leaned off the edge of the roof, fighting every reflex that urged me to move my foot back and regain my balance, knowing there was nothing but 15 feet of empty air behind me. Do you know the feeling when you tip your chair too far and begin to fall backward? The sensation was something like that, mixed with self-recrimination and the fear of death. I flailed my arms, knowing it wouldn't help, my mind gone suddenly blank with panic. The wind saved me. It gusted as I teetered on the edge of the roof, giving me just enough of a push that I could regain my balance. One of my flailing arms caught the now open window, and I scrambled desperately inside, not caring how much noise I made. Once through the window, I crouched on the floor, breathing hard. My heart was just beginning to slow when the wind caught the window and slammed it closed above my head, startling me all over again. I brought out my sympathy lamp, thumbed the switch to a dim setting, and swept the narrow arc of light around the room. Kilvin had been right to call it a thief's lamp. It was perfect for this sort of skulking about. It was miles to Imre and back, and I trusted Ambrose's curiosity would keep him waiting for his secret admirer for at least half an hour. Normally, looking for something as small as a ring would be a full day's job, but I guessed Ambrose wouldn't even think of hiding it. In his mind, it wasn't something he'd stolen. He would consider it either a trinket or a trophy. I set about methodically searching Ambrose's rooms. The ring wasn't on his chest of drawers or the bedside table. It wasn't in any of his desk drawers or on his jewelry tray in his dressing room. He didn't even have a locked jewelry box, mind you, just a tray with all manner of pins, rings, and chains scattered carelessly across it. I left everything where it was, which isn't to say I didn't think about robbing the bastard blind. Just a few pieces of his jewelry could pay my tuition for a year. But it went against my plan. Get in, find the ring, and get out. So long as I left no evidence of my visit, I guessed Ambrose would simply assume he'd lost the ring if he noticed it was gone at all. It was the perfect sort of crime. No suspicion, no pursuit, no consequences. Besides, it's notoriously difficult to fence jewelry in a town as small as Imre. It would be far too easy for someone to trace it back to me. That said, I've never claimed to be a priest, and there were plenty of opportunities for mischief in Ambrose's rooms. So I indulged myself. While checking Ambrose's pockets, I weakened a few seams so there was a fair chance of him splitting his pants up the back the next time he sat down or mounted his horse. I loosened the handle on his chimney's flue so it would eventually fall off and his room would fill with smoke while he scrambled to reattach it. I was trying to think of something to do to his damned irritating plumed hat when the oak twig in my pocket twitched violently, making me jump. Then it twitched again and broke sharply in half. I cursed bitterly under my breath. Ambrose couldn't have been gone for more than 20 minutes. What had brought him back so soon? I clicked off my sympathy lamp and stuffed it into my cloak. Then I scurried into the next room to make my escape through the window. It was irritating to go through all the trouble of getting in just to leave again, but as long as Ambrose didn't know anyone had broken into his rooms, I could simply come back another night. But the window didn't open. I pushed harder, wondering if it had jammed itself shut when the wind had slammed it. Then, I glimpsed a thin strip of brass running along the inside of the windowsill. I couldn't read the sigildry in the dim light, but I know wards when I see them. That explained why Ambrose was back so soon. He knew someone had broken in. What's more, the best sort of wards wouldn't just warn of an intruder. They would hold a door or window shut to seal a thief in. I bolted for the door, hands scrambling in the pockets of my cloak, looking for something long and slender I could use to foul the lock. Not finding anything suitable, I snatched a pen from his writing desk, jammed it into the keyhole, then jerked it hard sideways, breaking the metal head off inside the lock. A moment later, I heard a grating metallic noise as Ambrose attempted to unlock the door from his side, fumbling and cursing when he couldn't get his key to fit. By that point, I was already back at the window, shining my lamp back and forth along the strip of brass and murmuring runes under my breath. It was simple enough. I could render it useless by scratching out a handful of connecting runes, then open the window and escape. I hurried back to the sitting room and snatched the letter opener off his desk, knocking over the capped inkwell in my hurry. I was just about to begin eliding runes when I realized how stupid that would be. Any petty thief could break into Ambrose's rooms, but the number of people who knew enough Sigildry to foul a ward was much lower. I might as well sign my name on his window frame. I took a moment to collect my thoughts, then returned the letter opener to the desk and replaced the inkwell. I returned and examined the long brass strip more closely. Breaking something is simple. Understanding it is harder. This is doubly true when you're confronted with the sounds of muttered cursing from behind a door, accompanied by the clack and rattle of someone trying to unjam a lock. Then, the hallway went quiet, which was even more unnerving. I finally managed to puzzle out the sequence of wards as I heard several sets of footsteps in the hall. I broke my mind into 3 pieces and focused my alar as I pushed against the window. My hands and feet grew cold as I pulled heat from my body to counteract the ward, trying not to panic as I heard a loud thump as something heavy struck the door. The window swung open, and I scrambled backward over the sash and onto the roof as something struck the door again, and I heard the sharp crack of splintering wood. I still could have made it away safely, but when I set my right foot down on the roof, I felt a clay tile crack under my weight. As my foot slid, I grabbed the windowsill with both hands to steady myself. Then the wind gusted, catching the open window and flinging it toward my head. I brought up my arm to protect my face, and it struck my elbow instead, smashing one of the small panes of glass. The impact pushed me sideways onto my right foot, which slid the rest of the way out from underneath me. Then, since all my other options seemed to be exhausted, I decided it would be best if I fell off the roof. Acting on pure instinct, my hands scrabbled madly. I dislodged a few more clay tiles, then caught hold of the lip of the roof. My grip wasn't good, but it slowed and spun me so that I didn't land on my head or my back. Instead, I landed face down like a cat. Except a cat's legs are all the same length. I landed on my hands and knees. My hands merely stung, but my knees striking the cobblestones hurt as badly as anything I'd ever felt in my entire young life. The pain was blinding, and I heard myself yelp like a dog that's been kicked. A second later, a hail of heavy red roofing tiles fell around me. Most shattered on the cobblestones, but one clipped the back of my head, while another caught me square on the elbow, making my entire forearm go numb. I didn't spare it a moment's thought. A broken arm would heal, but expulsion from the university would last a lifetime. I pulled my hood up and forced myself to my feet, using one hand to make sure the hood of my cloak stayed in place. I staggered a few steps until I was under the eaves of the Golden Pony, out of sight of the upstairs window. Then I was running. Eventually, I made my careful limping way onto the rooftops and let myself into my room by the window. It was slow going, but I had little choice. I couldn't walk past everyone in the tap room disheveled, limping, and generally looking as if I'd just fallen off a roof. Once I caught my breath and spent some time abusing myself for several types of blinding idiocy, I took stock of my wounds. The good news was that I hadn't broken either of my legs, but I had splendid bruises blooming just below each knee. The tile that had grazed my head had left a lump, but hadn't cut me. And while my elbow throbbed with a dull ache, my hand was no longer numb. There was a knock at the door. I froze for a moment, then drew the birch twig from my pocket, muttering a quick binding, and jerked it back and forth. I heard a startled noise from out in the hall, followed by Willem's low laugh. "That's not funny," I heard Sim say. "Let us in." I let them in. Simmons sat on the edge of the bed, and Willem took the chair by the desk. I closed the door and sat on the other half of the bed. Even with all of us seated, the tiny room was crowded. We eyed each other soberly for a moment. Then Simmons spoke up. "Apparently Ambrose startled a thief in his rooms tonight. Fellow jumped out a window rather than get caught." I gave a brief, humorless laugh. "Hardly. I was almost out when the window blew shut on me." I gestured awkwardly. "Knocked me off the roof." Willem let out a relieved sigh. "I thought I had botched the binding." I shook my head. I had plenty of warning. I just wasn't as careful as I should have been. Why was he back so early? Simon asked, looking at Willem. Did you hear anything when he came in? It probably occurred to him that my handwriting is not especially feminine, Willem said. He had wards on his windows, I said. Probably linked to a ring or something he carries with him. They must have tipped him off as soon as I opened the window. Did you get it? Willem asked. I shook my head. Simon craned his neck to get a better look at my arm. Are you okay? I followed his eyes, but didn't see anything. Then I tugged at my shirt and noticed that it was stuck to the back of my arm. With all my other pains, I hadn't noticed it. Moving gingerly, I pulled my shirt up over my head. The elbow of the shirt was torn and speckled with blood. I cursed bitterly. I only owned 4 shirts, and now this one was ruined. I tried to get a look at the injury and quickly realized that you couldn't get a look at the back of your own elbow, no matter how much you wanted to. Eventually, I held it up for Simmons' inspection. It's not much, he said, holding his fingers a little more than 2 inches apart. There's only one cut and it's hardly bleeding. The rest of it's just scraped up. It looks like you scuffed it hard against something. Clay tile from the roof fell on me, I said. Lucky, Willem grunted. Who else could fall off a roof and end up with nothing more than a few scrapes? I've got bruises on my knees the size of apples, I said. I'll be lucky if I can walk tomorrow. But deep down, I knew he was right. The clay tile that had landed on my elbow could easily have broken my arm. The broken edges of the clay tiles were sometimes sharp as knives, so if it had hit me differently, it could have cut me down to the bone. I hate clay roofing tiles. Well, it could have been worse, Simmons said briskly as he came to his feet. Let's go to the Medica and get you patched up. Graham, no, Willem said. He can't go to the Medica. They will be asking to see if anyone is hurt. Simmons sat down again. Of course, he said, sounding vaguely disgusted with himself. I knew that. He looked me over. At least you're not hurt anywhere that people can see. I looked at Willem. You have a problem with blood, don't you? His expression grew slightly offended. I wouldn't say... His eyes darted to my elbow, and his face grew a little pale despite his dark Sealdish complexion. His mouth made a thin line. Yes. Fair enough. I started to cut my ruined shirt into strips of cloth. Congratulations, Sim. You've been promoted to field medic. I opened a drawer and brought out hook needle and gut, iodine, and a small pot of goose grease. Sim looked at the needle, then back at me, eyes wide. I gave him my best smile. It's easy. I'll talk you through it. I sat on the floor with my arm over my head while Simon washed, stitched, and bandaged my elbow. He surprised me by being nowhere near as squeamish as I'd expected. His hands were more careful and confident than those of many students in the Medica who did this sort of thing all the time. So, the 3 of us were here playing breath all night? Will asked, pointedly avoiding looking in my direction. Sounds good, Sim said. Can we say I won? No, I said. People must have seen Will at the pony. Lie, and they'll catch me for sure. Oh, Sim said. What do we say then? The truth. I pointed at Will. You were at the pony during the excitement, then came here to tell me about it. I nodded to the small table where a mass of gears, springs, and screws were spread in disarray. I showed you the harmony clock I found, and you both gave me advice on how to fix it. Sim seemed disappointed. Not very exciting. Simple lies are best, I said, getting to my feet. Thanks again, both of you. This could have gone terribly wrong without the 2 of you looking out for me. Sim got to his feet and opened the door. Will stood as well, but didn't turn to leave. I heard a strange rumor the other night, he said. Anything interesting? I asked. He nodded. Very. I remember hearing that you were done antagonizing a certain powerful member of the nobility. I was surprised that you had finally decided to let sleeping dogs lie. Come on, Will, Simmons said. Ambrose isn't sleeping. He's a dog with the froth that deserves to be put down." "He more resembles an angry bear," Willem said. "One you seem determined to prod with a burning stick." "How can you say that?" Sim said hotly. "In 2 years as a scriv, has he ever called you anything other than a filthy shim? And what about that time he almost blinded me by mixing my salts? Kvothe will be working the plumb bob out of his system for—" Will held up his hand and nodded to acknowledge Simmons' point. "I know this to be true, which is why I let myself be drawn into such foolishness. I merely wish to make a point." He looked at me. "You realize you have gone well over the hill concerning this Denna girl, don't you?" Chapter 21. Piecework. The pain in my knees kept me from any sort of decent sleep that night. So when the sky outside my window started to show the first pale light of coming dawn, I gave up, got dressed, and made my slow, painful way to the outskirts of town, looking for willow bark to chew. Along the way, I discovered several new, exciting bruises I hadn't been aware of the night before. The walk was pure agony, but I was glad I was making it in the early morning dark when the streets were empty. There was bound to be a lot of talk about last night's excitement at the Golden Pony. If anyone saw me limping, it would be too easy for them to jump to the right conclusions. Luckily, the trip loosened the stiffness in my legs, and the willow bark took the edge off the pain. By the time the sun was fully up, I felt well enough to appear in public. So I headed to the fishery, hoping to get in a few hours of piecework before Adept's sympathy. I needed to start earning money for next term's tuition and Davy's loan, not to mention bandages and a new shirt. Jackson wasn't in the stocks when I arrived, but I recognized the student there. We had entered the university at the same time and bunked close to each other for a little while in the mews. I liked him. He wasn't one of the nobility who drifted blithely through the school, carried by his family's name and money. His parents were wool merchants, and he worked to pay his tuition.